Well, Pakistan has was a front line state, as I said, so they have been part and party to everything.
What is the reason why you called it local terror?
Yeah, I wanted to, focus because this book has been written from South Asian perspective and not a Western or Arab perspective. I wanted to trace the roots of locally rooted terrorists who were aligned with these global terrorist group, and they were pursuing both the agendas, the local agenda as well as the global agenda, dictated by geopolitical churnings, wranglings also. Pakistan's effort to incite that kind of a jihad has failed. And that is why Pakistan started with cross-border attacks. And I think the region has changed because of those 4-5 years, which it's easier to comment, Safi, but I know it's easier said than done. But those 4-5 years was probably an opportunity, as many experts argue, to have struck a deal with Taliban and, to have actually hunted for Osama with more rigor with the help of, their local actors. Well, I'm working on the next book, and I think a lot of research that I've done while writing this book has already created a lot of material that will be a good backgrounder to what I'm started writing about. I think this is not an appropriate moment to divulge what I'm writing about, but it is very contemporary.
A 1990 batch IPS officer, worked several years at UP cadre. She did some stints in international organizations, then worked long years in the cabinet secretariat, went back to UP cadre, and then she superannuated from there. So we are bringing her here today for our podcast, not just as an IPS officer, but also as the author of this book, a very interesting book. We will largely focus all our discussions on the book, and after that, we'll see if we can take any other questions. So, welcome, Anju ma'am. How are you?
Thank you, Safi. Thanks for having me on this podcast. Good afternoon.
So, your career as an IPS officer, we haven't seen too many IPS officers writing books, especially on specialist subjects like counterterrorism. So, what made you think of writing a book like that?
I always felt that somebody had to really connect the dots across, say, 4 to 5 decades of history of our region, which actually shaped the security environment. And terrorism is one big manifestation of that security environment. And that is why I thought, after my retirement, I thought it's an opportunity for me to actually, do some hard research into actual data, credible data, and try and tell a story of how this has come about in our region.
So, this credible data must mean you must have read several books and international authors, Indian authors. That's how you must have prepared the research for this book.
Yes, a lot of books, but also a lot of reports which are there in the open source. Everything is pretty much from open source because you have to quote your source to tell a credible story, and which actually also includes a lot of declassified data of the US State Department, CIA, because we know that US has been a very important player in South Asia, not just in Afghanistan but in South Asia.
So, declassified documents from which years?
I would say 70s onwards.
Okay, so that's the time from when you traced this entire book. So let's go to the book. You started it off not with chapter one, but with an introduction. And that introduction basically takes us to the timeline of Afghanistan over 200 years. So what are you trying to show us when you start this book where you showed the timeline of Afghanistan?
I thought it was very important to remind the readers, many of them may know about it, that Afghanistan, the land of Afghanistan, has been a gateway between Asia and Europe that has witnessed several battles and several conquerors. And we know how the great game was fought in the land of Afghanistan between the Soviet Empire and the British Empire. Uh, I the this chapter was very important to let the readers know that Afghanistan story does not start in 1979 with Soviet invasion or after 9/11 when the war of terror started in Afghanistan. The centrality of Afghanistan, also Pakistan, which was part of British India until 1947, it has comes out very clearly in those decades, preceding 1979 Soviet invasion. So I wanted the reader to recap all that very quickly before start reading the story of South Asia.
So the jihad that we heard about, the almost the first time we started hearing the word jihad was when the non-Soviet forces started trying to push the Soviet forces out of Afghanistan 79 onwards. So there was a concept of local jihad, 1979 to 89 local jihad. Then you've written in your book that there is something that it was scaled up to global jihad. So what are you trying to tell us with that?
I think I'll start by saying that there is a concept of jihad in Islam which has two connotations. One is purely spiritual connotation, which is to purify your own self to get over your own negativity. And second is to defend Muslim land against invasion from non Muslims. So, because Afghans are a very religious society and uneducated also, they depend a lot on local clerics and religion, to guide their lives. It was easy for those who were resisting the Soviet troops, to use the connotation of, struggle against non-Muslim invasion of a Muslim land. So from there, the term of Afghan Jihad came. And that is why those who fought, the Afghans who fought against the Soviets and their brokers, power brokers in Afghanistan, came to be known as Afghan Mujahideen. So it was a purely local armed resistance, as we have seen in many parts of the world. But then something else happened. What happened is that because this was a proxy war, it became a proxy war. So because there was Soviet Union on one side, US and allies, started supporting the other side, Afghan Mujahideen. Pakistan became a frontline uh, state to offer its land and all the resources to wage this jihad. And Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries pitched in a very big way. Around the same time, um, a Palestinian Jordanian called Abdullah Azam, who's called the father of the modern jihad, which is really not the correct description. He is loaned by university in Saudi Arabia in Jeddah to Islamic University of Islamabad, which was General Zia's pet project. So he comes there somewhere close to 1981, and from there on he starts going to Peshawar. He's a guest of a noted Afghan Mujahideen Sayyaf, who was a favorite of Saudi Arabia. So he started getting into the Peshawar theater. He was an alien, he was a scholar, and and that is where his romance with the Afghan Mujahideen starts. And he's fully backed by the Pakistani state and Arab world and all the allies on the US side. And in 1984, he issues a fatwa. It is him who issued a fatwa, and this fatwa came to be interpreted as global jihad, whereby he says any able bodied Muslim man, it is incumbent on him to come and fight in local jihad happening anywhere in the world.
Beyond Afghanistan?
No, beyond your own local. Like Afghans had a mandate to fight the jihad only against, to defend their own land. But he said every able bodied Muslim man anywhere in the world has a duty, has a fard to defend, to participate. And so this doesn't have any sanctity in Islam, global jihad. And the endorsement didn't come from, the big ideologues or even Islamic movement like Muslim Brotherhood, which was very strong in the Arab world. Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia, of course, endorsed it. Cairo opposed it, but it set a framework for mobilization of thousands of Arabs into this land, saying that you're coming to fight a global jihad. So the local jihad got reframed in narrative as the global jihad. And that's how Pakistanis also in large numbers started participating in Afghan jihad.
So that's very interesting. So you're tracing an individual who was a cleric who in 1981, just 2 years after the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, was loaned from the Saudi Arabian Jeddah University to the Pakistani Islamabad University. And he was like on loan and possibly on a deputation and all that. And this cleric in 84, in just 3 years, turns around and gives an invitation that all able-bodied Muslims can come and fight the jihad in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Invitation to all the Muslims who want to fight a jihad to come there. And then you're saying that the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia supported it, but the Egyptian clerics did not.
Al-Cairo did not, which was a very important seat of Islam. They rejected it. Muslim Brotherhood did not support it.
Okay.
And the support didn't come from the Islamic world because there is no concept of global jihad in Islam.
Okay, so that's a very good setting for this discussion because this is a fact, especially the name of Abdullah Azam is not really well known. And it is something that you've really highlighted in your book. And I think it's a very interesting setting on which we'll be able to discuss further. So, from Abdullah Azam and his declaration of global jihad, how do we find this person called Osama bin Laden? Where did he come from? You've written about him, and you said that he also moved from Saudi Arabia and Jeddah. He was a Saudi national, from a rich family, and he moved to Peshawar. And he moved somewhere in 1984. He too moved in 84.
Yes, he moved in
So,
84.
can you trace the entire history of Osama bin Laden?
I've done it in great detail here because it was my curiosity as to when did Osama bin Laden come, where did his path cross with Abdullah Azam, and where did Zawahiri come from? Because Abdullah Azam, Osama bin Laden, and Zawahiri, and a couple of other which became top leadership of Al Qaeda, they set up what is called the Service Bureau. Service Bureau in Peshawar. The Service Bureau was created for mobilization of Arabs into the FPAC region. So, and they opened branches all across the world. So, Abdullah Azam, Osama bin Laden, Zawahiri, they were, principally running that. And of course, with the support of state actors on the side of the US. So, it was called Service Bureau. So, they would facilitate, they will launch propaganda, they will facilitate movement from other countries to Pakistan, to Peshawar, and then housing them, giving them all the support, and inducting some of them into the Afghan theater. So this is what they were doing, and that's something Osama bin Laden and Zawahiri and Abdullah Azam continued to do openly, visibly to the whole world.
Post 84.
Post 84.
After Osama bin Laden came into this theater.
Yes, Osama bin Laden became the face because he brought a lot of wealth. So he is the one who brought a lot of wealth. Zawahiri brought a lot of Egyptians with him, and he was also a very learned man. And Abdullah Azam became the ideologue.
Because Zawahiri was from Al Azhar University.
No, Zawahiri was a doctor from Egypt who was working in a hospital.
He was not a cleric.
He was not a cleric. Zawahiri was a doctor, trained doctor, and he also served after his degree in some rural areas outside Cairo for 3 years. I've documented all this. And then how his journey started into Afghanistan. So he came a little later from 84, but he basically became part of this Service Bureau.
So it's interesting the name Service Bureau because, and then you're saying the American state actors, basically the intel agencies must have been involved. But it was only American actors, or was it just Saudi actors, or it's a combination?
I would say it suffices to say that US and allies, the allies on the side of the US, were definitely supporting it. I have documented it how from Saudi Arabia and Egypt there was absolutely no bar in people taking, these Arabs taking flights into Pakistan.
Okay, flights.
And those flights also got some concessions that if you're taking a flight to Pakistan for this global jihad, so there was a discount. It's all very well documented. I've quoted sources.
That is fascinating. A discount to travel for jihad is quite a fascinating discount. I'm sure a lot of airlines should take notice of that. And so you're saying that Osama bin Laden, so between these three characters, how did Osama bin Laden started gain prominence in the Afghan theater?
See, he's the one who created Al Qaeda in 1988. He and Zawahiri and some other top Afghan, Arab and Egyptian. Those who were close to these two characters. It's not that every Arab and every Egyptian who came to the theater became Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda was very small when it started in 88. Even thereafter, I've documented it here that it was not big. Al Qaeda was very small, but they had very lethal plans, and they expanded throughout the world, and they had a lot of money. So he became the face after Abdullah Azam got killed in 1989 in I think Islamabad or Peshawar. When he got killed, then this Service Bureau came completely under the control of Osama bin Laden and Zawahiri, and also some of the branches across the world, including the one in New York, which I've spoken about. So he became, but again, I think to the world, he was just one huge financier of the so-called global jihad and Arab mobilization. Probably the general global community failed to see, what he was up to for many years thereafter.
So you're saying his financing he used to bring, which means his sources of finances are not very well documented.
No, it's very well documented. He had his own personal worth was millions and millions of dollars. His father had a huge business and he got a huge amount of money and a lot of money that he used to get every year. So he started using a lot of his money for his own group and also through the global jihad. Osama bin Laden used a lot of his money. He was getting money from other sources also, as I've documented. I've quoted sources because I don't have first-hand personal knowledge. So he used to get money from other sources, and we know how many people, rich Arab, contributed to this global jihad after it became global. And but Osama used a lot of his own personal wealth. In fact, that is one very important reason why Osama bin Laden became the chief of Al Qaeda.
So it was like the seed capital round for Al Qaeda, which came from Osama himself.
Yes.
And then the venture capital fund started coming from Arab rich people or
Some of them.
trusts and others.
Some of them, I would say it is, the Americans have documented it all very well, the financial networks of the US. So it's not, I can't name them straight away, but it's there.
So you're saying Abdullah Azam was killed in 89 and Osama created Al Qaeda in 1988. So this was just 1 year before the Soviets were to leave Afghanistan.
Few months before.
So what I'm trying to understand here is that there was a huge set of organization that was created separately for the Mujahideen. So there was Mujahideen and they had a completely organized system in which they had certain factions in the north, some factions in the south, some were Pashtun, some were Tajik, some were others, but they were all working as one. So was Osama bin Laden's band of few followers up to 1988, which declared Al-Qaeda, working in tandem with the regular Mujahideen in Afghanistan? Or was it a completely separate small minority group?
See, Al-Qaeda was a group on its own. And they had largely Arabs, Saudis and Egyptian predominantly. So they were a small pack. Now, the service bureau that they ran and the money that they provided aided the mobilization in very large numbers, which again took 3 years. It didn't happen in 84. It started picking up end of 87.
Oh.
For 3 years, they couldn't get the Arabs.
So 84 to 87, nobody was signing up for global jihad on those discounted.
Because there was no sanction in Islam. So from here you can figure out that without the state push, it couldn't have happened. So
something that,
and they were already radicals. They were only radical as Arabs. A normal Arab didn't come to the theater. They were already radical youth who were, who could have caused a lot of problem for Arab world. They came.
So what was the role of the friendly coalition partner Pakistan in all this?
Well, Pakistan was a front line state, as I said, so they have been part and party to everything.
So all the American allies, their forces, landing, equipment, logistics, all went via Pakistan.
Yeah, everything came via Pakistan.
And
there was no other way. They didn't have relations with Iran. They didn't have relations. The Soviet was on the other side. And the only country left was Pakistan.
Okay, so contiguously, Pakistan was the only one they went for. And these were very willing partners.
Oh, very willing partners.
And they were happy to drive the Soviets out of Afghanistan. And 79 was the time when Iran had its major revolution.
The Islamic Revolution took place in Iran.
And they were fighting a war with Iraq all this while. So they were very busy the other side. 80 to 88, they fought a war with Iraq. So the same time when this stuff was going on in this theater, they were fighting a war with Iraq the other side. So Iran and Iraq were very busy. So very interesting geography of that area. So it's good that you've studied all this. And you designed a very nice cover for this book. So what is the reason why you called it local terror?
Yeah, I wanted to focus, because this book has been written from South Asian perspective and not a Western or Arab perspective. I wanted to trace the roots of locally rooted terrorists who were aligned with these global terrorist group, and they were pursuing both the agendas, the local agenda as well as the global agenda, dictated by geopolitical churnings, wranglings also, were aligned to the Al Qaeda network. They had their own networks. They pursued both the agendas. And that is what makes them very dangerous, because they are poster boys of the path of radicalization and recruitment. And that is why, them as poster boys or heroes are still a threat to South Asia.
Still.
Still.
So, which means their name, their stories, they could be used by radicalizers to radicalize.
And recruiters,
other
yes,
people.
yes.
Okay, so
Yeah.
these are the 9 histories that should be studied by security professionals, and they should be careful that they should not get repeated. That's a very interesting point. So, the same characters after the Soviets moved out in 89, the Pakistanis, it's very, very well documented. You have also written about it. They started pushing them, what to do with them? They started pushing them into Kashmir and started trying to create the same Afghan jihad in Kashmir. So how did that go?
See, Pakistan tried to, incite an Afghan-like jihad in Kashmir. I think buoyed by the success of what had happened in Afghanistan, that Soviets withdrew, and but they really failed. So there's a whole chapter that I've written in which I have argued, how they have failed and why they failed. They failed because, one, the Arabs were aliens to Kashmir, and vice versa. So they could not move Arabs from their camps in Peshawar to POK and to Kashmir.
They
Very
refused
few
to
came.
move.
Some came. A few hundred came, but they could not. They couldn't do it in large numbers because Arabs were not interested. Kashmir was alien to them completely, and Kashmiri culture is a Sufi culture.
Okay.
So it completely failed. So Pakistan's effort to incite an Afghan-like jihad in Kashmir completely failed. And this is the point I really wanted to make, because normally people will say Kashmir jihad has failed. Pakistan's effort to incite that kind of a jihad has failed. And that is why Pakistan started with cross-border attacks. And I've documented many of those attacks. Very interesting. See, they didn't talk about jihad, but they did talk about violence, because we know that the insurgent groups of Kashmiris, say JKLF and HM, they were Kashmiris, and they took to arms. So they were local armed resistance for separate land. So they did not become local armed resistance for jihad, unlike Afghanistan. It hasn't even happened till today, although the effort from across the border don't end.
Keeps continuing.
Keeps continuing.
That the Americans, I think from 1998, started asking for Osama bin Laden to be handed over to them because they knew he was in Afghanistan. So why did Taliban 1.0, which is well established after 96, why did they not hand him over?
It was my assessment that Taliban did not hand over Osama bin Laden to the Americans after 1998, and the Americans persisted, and they actually used diplomatic route to get Osama bin Laden. My assessment is that Taliban didn't control Afghanistan, and they were into a very active civil war, at least in the northern area, against Northern Alliance. So Taliban were actually so much involved in the battle that they needed every support, and the support came from Al Qaeda and it came from Pakistan. So my sense is that both ISI and Al Qaeda are the two allies that the Taliban didn't want to lose, and they probably didn't realize what about 9/11, and that after 9/11 they will have to lose their kingdom, their empire. And they probably thought that they would have to continue to fight against the Northern Alliance. And that is where they would have to continue to bank on Al Qaeda's support, which was huge. And my assessment, it is monetary and maybe some expertise, and as well as Pakistan ISI. More importantly, I think until 1998, at least I think the West didn't get to know. West thought Osama bin Laden was a financier of terror group, but not as the chief of something so lethal. That came out only after 1998.
Okay. That's interesting. So then 2001, this 9/11 attack happened. Then the American and allies forces, they invaded Afghanistan, and there was a lot of stuff that was going on in Afghanistan. Then another 1.5 to 2 years later, the allies went and invaded Iraq. Okay, so after the invasion of Iraq, and we're not discussing the toppling of Saddam Hussein or anything of that kind because that's a subject of another book. What I would like to ask is that how did AQ, Al Qaeda in Iraq, start turning into something called ISIS?
Uh, I think this is one of the most. It was one of the most serious consequences of a regime change attempt. So Saddam was removed, um, and then started this. The US and UK. There were only two countries that entered Iraq in 2003. Saddam was removed. Ultimately, he was also caught and hanged. We all know. But they took. It took them 8 years to declare victory, to install some other government, to institutionalize some of the systems, which is not very easy. And they started giving scholarship to these Sunni Arab tribes who were very important and supporters of Saddam. So that's how they could actually bring some kind of a semblance of peace in Iraq. People could argue that it was not total peace. And then they left in December 2011
From Iraq.
from Iraq. And then in less than 16 months, we saw Al Qaeda in Iraq morphing into ISIS. It was the same character. What I want to say here is that it's important to understand that Al Qaeda in Iraq was an independent branch. It was not that Al Qaeda was controlling it, it was always independent. The Al Qaeda in Iraq actually took up that name in 2004, almost a year after the US invasion of Iraq. And they became a self professed branch, which of course Osama bin Laden accepted. So they were always local and independent, but lethal. It's a subject of very long discussion. So I would say that this local group that had become a branch of Al Qaeda morphed into ISIS. Uh, you know, one to probably distance from Al Qaeda, whatever leadership was left. And I think also they wanted to pursue their own agenda across the Middle East, which has always been the agenda of these, radical Arab groups. The Al Qaeda in Iraq was a deadly group, and they had a lot of muscle, and there were very serious issues with Saddam. There were allegations. In fact, I think for the longest, Americans, experts, and journalists thought that it was Saddam who was behind 9/11 and also earlier on WTC.
Okay.
Right. So there are testimonies that show. So that means there were concerns about Saddam even with regard to terror. See, for 4-5 years when they invaded Iraq, their focus shifted to Iraq, and you could actually see that there was hardly any action except for very focused CT action in the AFPAC region. There was hardly any action with regard to rebuilding Afghanistan, rebuilding their security forces. So there was a huge vacuum in Afghanistan. And I think it's my assessment, they probably saw Taliban as a ragtag army that was incapable of coming back to take on this multinational force which was there in Afghanistan. So I think there was one distraction, and I think there was also probably some kind of a lapse in judgment about what was happening in the AFPAC region.
Okay, so then that neglect of 3, 4, 5 years made them work harder in 2005, 6, 7.
War dragged on for 20 years in all because of that. And I think the region has changed because of those 4-5 years, it's easier to comment, Safi, but I know it's easier said than done. But those 4-5 years was probably an opportunity, as many experts argue, to have struck a deal with Taliban and, to have actually hunted for Osama with more rigor with the help of, their local actors. That's what many of the Western experts also argue, that probably America wasted those 4-5 years, 3-4 years, where Taliban was not, were not ready to be inducted back into Afghanistan. Of course, with the support of Pak ISI. There is no doubt about it.
So eventually, this 20-year war that the Americans and allies fought in Afghanistan, how was it eventually? What are the lessons learned for the Americans or the other allies of the 20 years of occupation in Afghanistan?
Well, I think they must have documented a lot of lessons with regard to, the effort to try and rebuild security forces in a different cultural setting, which is non-Western. That is the predominant strand that I see in their lessons learned. That we were trying to create Western style forces and institutions in Afghanistan, which kind of failed. It's a different cultural setting, and they have different nuances, different sensibilities. Uh, well, that might well be true. Uh, but my sense is that when there is a regime change, you not only change the top man, you actually disrupt the entire system, which is very hard to rebuild. Um, and and um, and that too in a different cultural setting. And plus, you would always end up creating insurgency whenever there's a regime change. It happened in Iraq, it happened in Afghanistan, it happened in Libya. So regime change leads to insurgency. I have no doubt about it. And the global terrorist actors will also align with those insurgencies or support them, or also take advantage of this. We've seen it consistently in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya and other theaters. So I think that is a lesson. I think that's a lesson for the whole world that regime change is probably is the most counterproductive action that you can change
So just thinking
a
around,
country by changing the top man.
yeah. So suppose you just like there's been a top man change in Iran, but no regime change, and there has been no boots on the ground from the US, or there are no allies there as such.
Mm.
From the US, there are no boots on the ground. So would you say that removal of the top guy plus changing the regime plus boots on the ground, all three together are what create insurgency?
Even if say the regime crumbled, current regime in Iran, let's suppose it had crumbled. Although I think it was known that they were fairly strong, they will not crumble. Written about it also. But supposing they had crumbled, that itself would have unleashed multiple forces, which would have been very difficult to control. And Iran is a big country. Iran is not a small country. And Iran has 14, 15 neighboring states, and it has a huge maritime border. So that would have been very chaotic, even if there was a regime change.
Okay.
You had some kind of a puppet sitting there. It would have still caused a lot of insurgency without the boots on the ground scenario.
And then different kind of ungoverned spaces would have crept up and
And then if you have your points person as the new regime, then there would be insurgency against them, whether you have boots on the ground or you don't have.
Okay.
It wouldn't have mattered.
So in the same in Afghanistan, since the change that happened on 15th of August in 2021, so this 15th August change that happened, it has a lot of stories have come out about it. That why did it happen? Why did the regime just decide to pack up and leave? And why were Taliban 2.0 just allowed to walk in? So are there any reasons that you proffer for that?
Well, President Biden, the then U.S. president, his speech is actually very instructive. I may not agree with all of it because it was written from American point of view, but I think one point it really makes sense. He says if they are not prepared to fight on their own and they will not fight the Taliban without American boots on the ground, then we can't continue to be there forever. So the Afghan polity and Afghan military leadership has to stand up. We've given them support for 20 years to be able to take on this fight on their own, but they are not willing to do so. Something like that, he said, which actually makes a lot of sense.
But I do believe that the ANA had really started coming up and their intelligence agency had already started coming up and they were becoming fairly standardized and strong. It's just that they needed budgetary support from the Americans, which suddenly stopped.
No, I don't think that's true because the budget had been allocated even for that year and the year later. This is another point that I really have done a lot of research on, tracing this fight, from Obama's regime to Trump 1.0 to Biden and to Trump to Biden. So I have really traced the American assessment on Afghanistan, their fighting capability, their polity, etc. I think that should give a good idea as to how Americans were assessing.
So I think thank you so much. This was very interesting conversation.
Thank you.
Starting from the Arab lands and Egypt, how we went to Afghanistan from 79 to 89, then 89 to 96, Taliban 1.0 came on in 96, how the Al Qaeda started getting stronger and stronger. And then 2001, the Americans came into Afghanistan, 2003, Iraq. They neglected Afghanistan for 4 5 years from 2001 to 5 or 6. And then it took them that much more time to be able to so called control it. And they eventually had to leave. And its impact on the US. And in all this, Pakistan is right in the middle and center, whether it is war and peace. So from 79, they created so much trouble in all these neighborhoods, right up to the time now where they're preventing to be the peacemakers. So this is a very fascinating conversation. And I know we've been talking for a very long time, but I hope you'll be writing another book on any other subject. If you wish to tell us about that, please do. Otherwise, we can end the call.
Well, I'm working on the next book, and I think a lot of research that I've done while writing this book has already created a lot of material that will be a good backgrounder to what I'm started writing about. I think this is not an appropriate moment to divulge what I'm writing about, but it is very contemporary.
So when you come with your next book, please do oblige us with another podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank